You have always known how to read a room, how to read a person, how to understand before anyone says anything where the power is and where it is going. This is not cruelty. It is survival. It has always been survival. But there are some things you cannot read your way out of. Some things that arrive before the reading can begin. She arrived on a Tuesday. Everything changed on a Wednesday. Before we begin, this story is told from a different angle. The other stories in this series have been told from the outside of this tribe by the person who was sent away, who survived alone, who came back with meat and knowledge and a quiet kind of power. You know that story. You were not in it. Or rather, you were in it, at the edges, in the background, the woman who watched from behind the older woman when he returned to the border, the woman whose face was very still. This is your story. And it begins, as all the most honest stories begin, not with the dramatic moment, but with the truth underneath it. The truth about who you are and why you made the choices you made and what you understood about the world before the shaman arrived and made it complicated. In this story, you are the chief's wife. This is what you saw, and this is what you felt. This is what you did or did not do. And the difference between those two things is something only you will ever fully know. You have never been naive. This is the first and most important thing about you, the thing that everything else grows from. You were born into a world with very clear rules about what women could have and how they could have it. And you looked at those rules the way a skilled hunter looks at difficult terrain, not with resentment, not with despair, but with the careful calculating attention of someone who intends to navigate it successfully. You are beautiful. You know this the way you know which plants are edible and which are not, as a practical fact with practical implications. Beauty in a woman in your world is a resource, and resources are to be managed wisely and not squandered on sentiment. You are also intelligent, perceptive. You notice things before others do, and you remember what you notice, and you understand the patterns that connect observations over time. This quality is less visible than the beauty and more useful. It has served you better. When you were young, you watched the women around you and understood quickly what the successful ones had in common. Not the prettiest or the most well-liked. The ones who survived well, who ate first, who were warm in winter, who were protected when the tribe faced danger. What they had in common was this: they stood beside power, not behind it, not in front of it, beside it, close enough to share in it, careful enough not to threaten it. You decided, at an age when most of the girls around you were still thinking about very different things, that this was what you would do. You would find the power. You would stand beside it. You would make yourself indispensable to it. This was not a cold decision. It was a clear one. There is a difference. Survival is not the absence of feeling. It is the management of feeling in the service of continuing. The women who survived best in your world were not the ones who felt nothing. They were the ones who felt everything and moved through it anyway, who used what they felt as information rather than as instruction. You learned this early. You have practiced it your whole life. It has cost you things you did not always know you were paying. The first chief was not the man you chose. He was the man who was there when you were of the age to choose. And you assessed him the way you assessed everything, with the careful eye of someone who understood what she was looking at. He was strong. He had led the tribe through 2 difficult seasons without losing anyone to starvation. He was respected. His word was followed without question. He was also beginning to slow. This was not visible yet to most of the tribe. The slowing was in small things, the slight hesitation before a decision that previously would have been instantaneous, the occasional error of judgment that he corrected quickly, but that told you something. The body beginning to negotiate with itself in ways it had not needed to before. You saw it because you were looking for it. You were always looking for it. You had been with him for 3 years when you first noticed the other one. He was younger, not yet fully established, not yet the person he would become. But there was something in him that you recognized immediately, the particular quality of a person in whom power was not yet arrived, but was clearly on its way. You had seen it once before, in the old chief, when he was young, before the slowing, a steadiness, a capacity for patience, the specific intelligence of someone who had learned to see the world clearly rather than as they wished it to be. You watched him for a season before you did anything. You were not in a hurry. Hurry was for people who had not thought far enough ahead. The choice you were making was not about affection, though there was something that might have become affection given different circumstances. And it was about the reading of a situation and the correct response to it. The old chief's power was contracting. The young man's power was expanding. Power does not stay still. It moves always toward the person who can hold it. You intended to move with it. The beginning was a path. You were carrying plants back from the gathering, your arms full, the path narrow at that particular point where the roots made the ground uneven. He was coming the other way, carrying water. You looked at him. He looked at you. The look lasted less than a breath, but you had been waiting for the right moment, and your body recognized it before your mind could catch up. You let the path be slightly narrower than it was. You let the space between you be slightly smaller than necessary. Not much. Enough. His expression when you passed did not change noticeably, but his eyes did something, a small adjustment, a recalibration, the specific look of a person who has just received information they were not expecting. Good. The wood gathering came later. You had been watching his patterns, the times he went to the forest edge for fuel, and you arranged to be there on one of those mornings, not obviously, simply present, gathering what you needed at the same location. When your hands found the same branch, you did not pull away immediately, a fraction of a second longer than accident, long enough to be felt, short enough to be deniable. You watched his face carefully in the moment after, the slight warmth, the effort to return to neutral. You filed this information away with everything else you had been collecting. He was not indifferent to you. This was confirmed. You have never told anyone this. But there was no one to tell and no language for it anyway. But the truth is that the moment on the path and the moment with the wood were not accidents. You made them happen. You understood what you were doing, and you did it with the full clarity of someone who had decided on a course of action and was executing it carefully. What he felt in those moments was real. What you felt was more complicated. Both things were true at the same time. The full moon night you did not plan. This is the honest thing to say. You had been managing the situation carefully, the gradual proximity, the small moments of contact, the patient accumulation of a connection that would become, in time, too strong to ignore. You had a plan, and the plan was working, and then the full moon came, and something in you that was not the plan decided to go outside. You told yourself it was to check on a sound you had heard. You told yourself you could not sleep. These were not entirely lies. He was already outside, looking at the moon. You sat beside him. You had sat beside many people in your life with full awareness of what you were doing and why. This was different. You sat beside him, and the plan receded slightly, and something else was present, something that did not have a name in your language, and a quality of the moment that you had not manufactured and could not fully control. The moon was very bright. You looked at it together and said nothing, and the silence had a weight to it that was not the weight of strategy. It was something older and less manageable. When you went back inside, you lay in the dark and thought about the difference between what you had intended and what had happened. The intention had been correct. The execution had been correct. And underneath all of it, undeniably, was something that had not been part of the plan. You filed this information away too, under a different category. The most careful people are often surprised by themselves, not because they are careless, but because they are human, and humans contain things that careful planning cannot fully account for. You had built a very good plan. The plan had worked, and in the working of it, something genuine had crept in through the edges, small and inconvenient and real. You chose not to examine it too closely. Examination of that kind was not useful. When the old chief sent him away, you were not surprised. You had seen it coming. The accumulation of small signs over many weeks. The chief's eyes following the younger man with a quality of attention that had shifted from assessment to something else. The specific vigilance of a leader who has identified something he cannot address directly. You watched from behind the older woman when he left. Your face was very still. You had practiced a still face for years, and it did not fail you now. But inside the stillness, something was happening that you observed with the same careful attention you gave to everything, which did not make it smaller, only more accurately known. He walked into the trees and did not look back. The tribe closed around his absence the way water closes around a stone. Life continued. The chief led. You stood beside him, as you had always stood beside him, performing the role you had chosen with the competence you had always brought to it. But something had changed in the performing of it. Before, the role had felt like the right shape for you, the correct fit between your nature and your circumstances. After, it felt more like a garment you were wearing, still yours, still serving its purpose, but more clearly a garment than it had felt before. You did not examine this change too closely. Examination of that kind was not useful. Loss is strange when you have never fully acknowledged the thing you lost, and you had not let yourself name what you felt on those two occasions, on the path and at the woodpile and in the moonlight. You had filed it carefully in a category you did not open often, and now it was gone, and the not naming of it did not protect you from the not having of it. The body knows what it has lost, even when the mind has kept no records. When he came back to the border with meat, you were there. Of course you were there. The whole tribe was there. You stood behind the older woman the way you always stood, your face arranged into the appropriate expression of careful neutrality, your eyes doing the real work. He was different. The man who had left was someone you had been building a connection with, carefully and deliberately, a person still in the process of becoming. The man at the border was someone who had become. The forest had finished something in him that had been unfinished when he left, had pressed and shaped and refined until what remained was cleaner and harder and more itself. You felt something looking at him that you did not let show on your face. The chief accepted the meat without speaking, as this was the correct response, and the chief was nothing if not correct. But you read what was underneath the correctness, the tightening of something, the specific quality of a man who has just understood that the ground has shifted and is deciding how to stand on it. He came back. He brought others. He taught the tribe a new hunting ground. He did all of this without a single direct challenge, without a word of confrontation. And you watched the chief's face and understood that this was the most dangerous kind of challenge there was. You had chosen correctly. This is what his return confirmed, and the confirmation was not comfortable. You had seen the light in him when it was still small, and you had moved toward it, and you had been right about what it would become. At the correctness of your judgment did not make the current situation easier. It made it more complicated. You had chosen him for his power. He had returned more powerful than you anticipated. And he was not yours. She came out of the eastern trees on a still afternoon. You saw her before most of the others did. You were positioned, as you usually were, where you could see the approaches to the camp, a habit so old it had become unconscious, the reflexive watchfulness of someone who had learned early that information arrived before it announced itself. She showed her hands, open, palms forward. You assessed her the way you assessed everything, young, perhaps your own age or slightly younger, dark hair, long, loose around her face. The kind of face that was immediately and completely itself. No performance in it, no management, just the direct presentation of a person who had nothing to hide, or perhaps simply had not learned to hide it. Her eyes were extraordinary, dark and very still. The eyes of someone who had looked at something you had not looked at and come back, changed by the looking. She was beautiful. This registered in you as information before anything else. Not the jealous recognition, not yet. Simply the fact, noted and filed. She was beautiful in the way that some people were beautiful, not through arrangement or effort, but through the specific quality of being entirely what they were. She was brought to the fire. The tribe received her with the careful hospitality of people who had learned that strangers could become allies. Everyone sat. The evening was ordinary. You watched her, and she watched the fire, and nothing happened. You went to sleep telling yourself everything was the same as it had been that morning. The arrival of a threat is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself. It sits at your fire and warms itself and eats with you and says nothing particular, and you go to sleep thinking everything is fine, and in the morning everything is different, and you cannot quite identify the moment when it changed. You woke before the others. This was usual. You had always been an early riser, the habit built from years of understanding that the early hours belonged to whoever claimed them. You went outside into the cold gray of pre-dawn and breathed the air and looked at the camp and the trees. They were at the fire, he and the shaman, sitting on the same side of the fire's remains, close but not touching, both looking at something in the distance, or perhaps at nothing, the specific quality of two people who are comfortable with each other's silence. He was talking, low and unhurried, and she was listening with her whole body, that quality of attention she had that made you feel, watching it, that everything else in her field of awareness had been set aside. He laughed at something. You stood at the edge of the camp and watched him laugh, and felt something move through you that you had not felt before, small and sharp and precise, like a splinter entering the skin. Not large, not overwhelming, but there. You recognized it from the outside before you recognized it from the inside. You had seen it in others, in the old tribe, in the careful management of faces, when someone else had something they wanted, the specific expression of a person who is trying to contain a feeling that does not want to be contained. You turned. You went back to your sleeping place. You lay down. The feeling was still there. The first jealousy is not rage. It is much smaller and much more precise than rage. It is a single point of clarity, cold and accurate, that says, something that should be yours is being given to someone else. That you had felt many things in your life, you had not felt this. It was, in its own way, a kind of discovery. In the days that followed, you watched her. You were good at watching without appearing to watch. Years of practice had made it nearly invisible, the attention directed elsewhere, while the real observation happened in the peripheral vision, in the hearing, in the small gaps between ordinary tasks. She was gifted. This was immediately apparent, and it would have been dishonest to pretend otherwise. The way she moved through the tribe, quiet and present, attending to whoever needed attending to. The old man whose cough had been worsening, she sat with him one afternoon and did something with her hands and certain plants and her voice, low and steady. And the next morning, his cough was different, not gone, but changed in quality, a less harsh. He looked better. The tribe noticed. A child fell and cut her leg badly on a sharp stone, the kind of cut that went deep and bled freely. The shaman cleaned it and packed it with something from her bag and bound it with a skill and speed that spoke of long practice. The child cried, and then, while the shaman was working, stopped crying. Not because the pain had stopped, because the shaman was talking to her in a low, continuous voice that seemed to go under the pain rather than around it. 2 days later, the wound was closing cleanly. The tribe was learning to look for her when something was wrong. You watched this learning happen, and you watched what it cost the chief in terms of the attention that had previously flowed toward him, the small daily reinforcements of his centrality. Not much, enough. As she was taking up space that had not been empty before. The most difficult thing to resent is genuine goodness. If she had been cruel or selfish or foolish, it would have been simple. But she was none of those things. She was careful and kind and extraordinarily skilled, and the tribe needed what she had, genuinely needed it. And watching her give it to them, you felt something that you could not name cleanly, the tangled feeling of recognizing a quality you do not have in someone who does not need to take anything from you to have it. This is the most complicated kind of envy. It has no clean target. Shortly after the shaman's arrival, another person joined the tribe. A man, large and broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that filled whatever space he occupied without effort or intention. He was quiet, patient, clearly skilled, and within a few days had made himself useful in the way that genuinely capable people make themselves useful, by doing what was needed without waiting to be asked. The tribe received him well. You noted his arrival, filed it, moved on. What you noted more carefully was a single moment, brief and unremarkable to anyone who was not watching. The shaman and the new man passing each other near the water. A glance held slightly longer than neutral, nothing more. You filed this separately, under a category you were increasingly reluctant to open because you had seen that glance before, and you had given that glance before. On a narrow path, a long time ago, to a man who was not yet the chief, but in whom you had seen the light that power makes as it grows. The pattern was not lost on you. You did not examine what the pattern meant. Examination of that kind was not useful, but you filed it carefully next to everything else. Patterns repeat because the underlying conditions repeat, not because the people are the same, but because the forces that shape people are the same. What you did on that path was what every person does when they see something they want and understand that wanting alone is not sufficient. What the shaman did in that glance was the same thing. The recognition of potential, the beginning of an assessment. You knew this from the inside in a way that made watching it from the outside very strange indeed. Yet you followed them. This was not a decision you made in advance. You were moving through the trees at the edge of the camp, gathering something, half attending to the task, when you saw them leave together, the chief and the shaman, walking in the direction of the deeper forest. Not quickly, not furtively, simply walking the way two people walk when they are going somewhere together and have agreed on the direction. You followed at a distance. The forest was quiet around you. You moved carefully, as you had learned to move in the forest, not disturbing what did not need disturbing, your footsteps finding the soft ground. The distance between you and them was enough that they could not hear you. It was not enough that you could not see them. They walked for some time without speaking. This was, you noted, something they seemed to do often. The comfortable silence you had observed at the fire, not the silence of people who had run out of things to say. The silence of people who did not need to fill space with words to be at ease with each other. Then they stopped at a place where the trees opened slightly, a small clearing with a fallen log and the sound of water somewhere nearby. They sat on the log. He said something. She responded. You were too far to hear the words. Then he reached out and took her hand, not urgently, not dramatically. The way you take the hand of someone when you want to show them that you are present, that you see them, that the conversation you are having is real. He held her hand, and she looked at their hand, and then she looked at him, and something passed between them that you watched from behind a tree 20 feet away. Yet your hands were very still at your sides. The feeling that had arrived as a splinter the morning after she came was no longer small. It had grown in the days since, fed by every observation, every moment, filed carefully in the category you had been trying not to open. Now the category was open and the feeling was out, and it was not small at all. You stood behind the tree and did not move and did not make a sound and watched them sit together in the small clearing with the sound of water nearby. You had done this. You had done exactly this on a path, at a woodpile, in the moonlight. You had given those moments to him with the full deliberate intention of creating exactly what you were now watching. You had succeeded, and the success was sitting on a log holding another woman's hand. And there is a specific punishment available only to the very clear-sighted, which is the ability to understand exactly what is happening and exactly why, with no comfortable distortions of perception to soften it. You could see all of it, the pattern you had set in motion, the place it had arrived, the difference between what you had intended and what you had felt, and the distance between those two things that you had never allowed yourself to fully measure. You saw all of this. It did not help. You walked back to the camp alone. Your face was very still. Some nights later, the shaman went to the forest alone. You knew this because you had been sleeping badly. The shallow, restless sleep of a person whose mind would not stop working, turning over the same materials again and again without arriving at anything new. You heard her leave, and you lay still and listened to her footsteps fade into the trees. After a while, you got up. You told yourself you were restless. You told yourself you needed air. These were not entirely lies. You found her by the small glow before you found her by sight. A fire, small and deliberate, not a campfire, but a ritual fire, the specific quality of a flame that has been built for a purpose. You stopped at the edge of the trees and looked. She was sitting before it. The forest was completely dark on all sides, and the fire was the only light, and it illuminated her the way fire illuminates things. It finds worth illuminating fully and without mercy. She had her eyes half closed and her hands open on her knees, and the thin, pale smoke from whatever she had added to the fire moved around her in the still night air. She was in the space between. You had seen this before, slightly, in the afternoons when she worked on the sick, a quality of not quite here that her face took on. But this was deeper. The face that the fire showed you was not a face in the ordinary world. It was something else. Somewhere between this side and the other, exactly at the threshold, held there by whatever knowledge she carried and whatever she had taken into herself from the smoke. She was, in that moment, at the most beautiful thing you had ever seen. You stood in the dark, and this was the most complicated feeling of your life. The thing you felt looking at her in the firelight, because it was not simple. It was not hate. It was not even envy exactly. It was the feeling of looking at something that was genuinely extraordinary and understanding simultaneously that its extraordinariness was the precise shape of everything you stood to lose. You watched for a long time. Then you went back to your sleeping place and lay down and did not sleep. Beauty is neutral. It does not intend anything, and it does not apologize for what it does. The fire found her and showed her to you, and you saw her, and what you felt was yours, not hers. She had not done anything to you. She had simply been what she was, in the firelight, going to the place between. That the feeling was entirely your own. This made it go smaller. If anything, it made it larger. The thought arrived 3 nights later, not dramatically. Thoughts of this kind never arrived dramatically in your experience. They slid in sideways, in the hours when the mind was not fully guarded, presenting themselves as neutral observations before their full weight became clear. You were lying awake, as you had been lying awake most nights since the shaman's arrival. The camp was quiet. The fire had burned to coals. Somewhere outside, an animal moved through the undergrowth and was gone. The thought was this: the plants she used had doses. Every plant had a dose that healed and a dose that did not heal. She knew this. It was the foundation of her work. The careful measurement, the precise preparation, and the difference between the amount that helped and the amount that did not. That was the thought. You examined it in the dark with the same careful attention you gave to everything. It sat there, neutral and factual, a simple observation about the nature of plant medicine, nothing more. You tried to put it aside. It did not go. You told yourself it was not a plan. It was not even a wish. It was an observation, the kind of observation that a mind like yours made automatically, filing information, noting possibilities. The mind that had spent a lifetime reading situations and understanding options was doing what it always did. You told yourself this very clearly. The thought stayed. There is a difference between thinking something and doing something. This is the difference that matters, the one that separates a thought from an act, a possibility from a choice. You had thought many things in your life that you had not acted on, had felt many things you had not expressed, had known many things you had not used. The thought was there. It was yours. What you did with it was also yours, and the record of that is written somewhere that is not available to anyone else. Only you know what you did. Only you know what you did not do. It was the young woman with the quick eyes who found her. She had gone to wake the shaman as she usually did, the easy familiarity of 2 women who had become accustomed to each other's mornings. She came back to the camp quickly, not running, but with the specific quality of fast walking that was more alarming than running, and said something low and urgent to the man, to him, to the chief. You were already awake. You were always awake early. He went quickly, and you went with him, with the others, the tribe assembling itself around an emergency the way tribes did, drawn by the quality of alarm in the quick woman's face. She was lying where she had been sleeping, on her back, her face turned slightly to one side, her hands at her sides. She looked very peaceful. She looked as though she were sleeping deeply, the specific stillness of a person in the depths of sleep, the kind you did not want to disturb. He crouched beside her. He put his hand on her arm. She did not move. He said her name. The tribe had learned her name in the weeks since her arrival, and he said it now in a voice that was not the chief's voice, that was something underneath the chief's voice, something that you had not heard from him before. She did not respond. The tribe crowded close and then stepped back, the instinctive retreat from something that could not be helped by proximity. The quick woman was very still. The broad-shouldered new man stood at the edge of the group with his arms at his sides. You stood among them and looked at her lying there, and your face was very still. The tribe began to say what it always said when it found someone who would not wake. The careful words, the practical assessments, the gradual arriving at the conclusion that the night had taken her. Perhaps the ritual, they said, perhaps the smoke, in too great a quantity. These things happened. They had happened before. You listened to them say this. You looked at her face, peaceful, and turned slightly to one side, and you thought about the night you had stood in the trees and watched her in the firelight and felt the most complicated feeling of your life. You thought about the thought that had come at night. You thought about the difference between thinking something and doing something. You looked at her face, and you knew what you knew, and you did not say it. How many people were in the camp that night? How many of them knew what she used and how much of it she used? And how many of them had reason to want the outcome that the morning had delivered? The tribe counted one explanation and moved toward it with the efficiency of people who needed an explanation in order to continue. You stood among them, and you knew what you knew. What you knew and what you did are two different things. Only you know if they were the same thing on this particular morning. Only you will ever know. She did not wake that day. She did not wake the day after. On the third day, when they went to where she had been lying, she was not there. The sleeping place was empty. The body was gone. No one could explain it. No one tried to explain it for very long because there were other things that needed explaining, and the living required attention that the dead did not. You said nothing. You have said nothing since. And this is the story of what you saw and what you felt and what you did or did not do in the space between seeing and feeling. The record of it exists only inside you. It will stay there. A note on history. Jealousy as an emotional experience appears to be universal across human cultures and is documented in every era of recorded history. Evolutionary psychologists argue that jealousy has deep adaptive roots, functioning as a mechanism for protecting pair bonds and social position. In small groups, where survival depended on social standing and access to resources, the loss of a valued partner or position represented a genuine threat to survival. The figure of the healer or shaman was a position of considerable power and social capital in prehistoric communities. The arrival of a new healer in an established group would have created complex dynamics around authority, influence, and social position that would have affected everyone in the group. The ambiguity at the end of this story is intentional and historical. In small communities across human history, deaths that could have been accidental or deliberate were often left ambiguous, absorbed into the group's understanding as misfortune without the interrogation that would require resources and create conflict the group could not afford. What happened in this story is not resolved because it was not resolved. The woman in it knows what she knows. The record she carries is private. This is how most of the actual history of human interior life has always been stored, not in archaeology or documents, but in the minds of the people who lived it, carried for a lifetime, and then gone. The shaman's body was not found. This is the only fact that remains after everything else. Draw your own conclusion. The woman in this story has drawn hers. Good night.